Okay, good evening, everybody. Nice to speak to you guys again. Hope you're doing very well. Today, the plan is to look at another one of Angela Carter's short stories. So far, in whatever way, we have discussed two of her short stories. One, The Snow Child, in a live class a couple of weeks ago, and then in a shorter recording that I gave you guys, we looked at The Company of Wolves. So I think by this point you have probably kind of a good idea of what Carter's about. And I think she finds her fullest expression in the story we are going to be discussing today, called The Bloody Chamber. Um, we probably are not going to finish the story, looking at the story tonight, because it's kind of long. It's her longest story. It's all of 40 pages or so. That's pretty long for a short story. So we aren't going to finish it tonight. I'll tidy it up in a shorter recording that I'll do next week for you guys. But if you've read the story so far, I think you won't be too surprised or shocked at the direction in which Carter is going with this one. It's also it's the title that she puts first in the collection, and it's also the title of the collection as a whole. So there's something about this particular story of hers that she thinks is, I don't know, probably maybe her best work, or the story that captures in full everything it is that she's trying to do. And we've spoken so far about how Carter certainly is a willfully, deliberately shocking writer. And just looking at the two stories we've done so far, The Snow Child with Company of Wolves, in those stories, what she's really doing literally is playing around with, in the first story, necrophilia, and in the second story, bestiality, right? So pretty gross, transgressive stuff, things we don't really like to talk about, things we don't want to have as a focus of our entertainment or our short stories, you know. So she really does push the boundaries of what's acceptable to say. And it's no different in the story either. This one certainly is, again, comes with an R18 warning for sex, nudity, and violence. Parental guidance strongly advised for sensitive viewers / readers. This one, like I say, is the story where she finds the fullest expression of what it is that she's trying to do, and as well as her talent. She's very macabre and gross in the story. I think it borders a little bit on being even a bit pornographic, perhaps. And there certainly is a lot of violence, all of which is capped off by an ending in which she does similar things to The Company of Wolves and Snow Child, where it's the female character in the story who has to sort out the bad guy. So it's the woman who does the winning in the end. So in that way, you can maybe say the story is quite feminist. So we're going to be looking at how she puts that all together in the story. My plan is also just to leave maybe 15 or 20 minutes open at the end, just in case you have any questions about part one. We did have the NSS, but in case something else has come up around sourcing or ideas or how to do something, you can ask me at the end of the class. I'll leave a few minutes open at the end to discuss it. So if you have anything to say, you can pop your question in the chat or come on the mic, and I'll go over it for you. Okay, so like I said, this story starts on page 1 of the collection. It's the first story. It is also based on a very famous French fairy tale. So all of Carter's stories are inspired by, based on, she's doing a kind of a version of, a reimagining, a retelling, whatever word you want to use, of an original fairy tale. Company of Wolves, Little Red Riding Hood. Snow Child, Snow White. This one is Bluebeard. I don't know. It was one of the prescribed stories that you would have done in semester 1. That doesn't necessarily mean that you did it in class or you read it, but I usually always do teach Bluebeard in the first semester because I know that I'm going to do the Bloody Chamber in second semester. So I'm going to give you a little bit of a spiel here about what Bluebeard is actually about, in case you don't remember or you haven't read it before. But it's a French fairy tale, and indeed, Carter's story, The Bloody Chamber, is also a story set in France. It's got some French words, and the heroine in the story comes from Paris, so she's kept this very French outlook or attitude in the story. And Bluebeard is the name of a fairy tale, but Bluebeard is also a character within the fairy tale. And who he is this kind of a marquis, so a nobleman, a noble figure, a member of the French aristocracy, who is, as I say here, a very, very rich and powerful man. He's also a serial marrier of beautiful women, all of whom mysteriously die. So this is the original French fairy tale. In the beginning of the story, he gets a new wife, and at some point and he takes her back to his castle where she begins to live as his wife. And at some point in the story, he gives her a set of keys and says to her that you are allowed anywhere in this castle you want to go. Any room, any chamber is open to you, except for one room. And he shows her the key to the room that is forbidden and says, do not ever use this key. Go into this room and see what's in that room. If you do, there'll be a big problem. And as you might imagine, that's exactly what she does. As soon as her husband goes away for a while, she takes the keys and goes into the room that she is forbidden to go into. And that's just human nature. That's what any of us would do. If we are told, do not do something, or do not think of something, or never say something, we feel hugely impelled by our own human nature to do or say or think that exact thing, right? We are just hard to control. We go our own way, and we want to do what pleases us and not necessarily follow the rules, right? So that's exactly what she does in the original fairy tale. She disobeys her husband and follows her own gut instinct and curiosity to see what's going on in that room, right? And the floor, as she enters it, is flooded with blood and the murdered corpses of Bluebeard's former wives, who are hanging on hooks from the walls all around her. And this character is horrified. She gets a huge fright. She didn't expect this to be the case, that all of the wives who preceded her have been murdered by her husband Bluebeard. She drops the key in the blood and flees the room. She tries to get the key back. She tries to retrieve it and wash the blood off the key. But this key is, of course, magical because we're living in a fairy tale reality here. And she can't get the blood off. It can't be removed. So Bluebeard, when he gets his keys back, notices that the forbidden key to the forbidden room is stained with blood and that his wife disobeyed him. And now she has to die. But just in the nick of time, the wife's brothers arrive to save her, and they kill Bluebeard. She inherits his whole fortune and has all the dead wives buried respectfully. She uses that money to have herself and her other siblings married. And so we have the happily ever after fairy tale ending, right? And that's the standard version of Bluebeard, more or less. There's been adaptations and retellings of it, but that's more or less the standard version. Young woman marries rich older man. He turns out to be a serial killer. He tries to kill her. Brothers, the men, swoop in, save her, happily ever after. Angela Carter actually keeps that basic structure throughout the fairy tale. She doesn't always do that. Like Company of Wolves and Snow Child, they have slightly different features to their originals, but this one actually quite closely corresponds to the well-known famous version of it. So that's an interesting thing that she's done there, an interesting choice, is that she's kind of keeping the skeleton, to use a word, more or less the same. And if you want to know, like, fairy tales always come with a moral or a lesson in some way, and I guess the The moral of the Bluebeard as a fairy tale is that it's a cautionary story about the dangers of curiosity, and the importance of obedience, I would say. It also explores themes of violence, marriage, and the power that people hold over each other in a marriage. Usually the power that a man, the patriarchal figure, exerts over the woman, the weaker party, and how marriage itself is a system, an institution of obedience, right? It kind of is something used by men to control women, and that if women do not marry well, they will get into trouble. Their lives will be bad, so they have to make the right choice. But once they are married, if they do not obey their husband, then they can also end up in trouble. So, I mean, there's many ways you can interpret it, but the way I always see it is a kind of a cautionary tale. Watch out. This is a story about what you should not do. Don't just get married to somebody because he's rich and powerful. Well, if you do, be very careful around him. Watch out, right? And I think that's what she's playing with as well in the story, is the sense of trying to communicate a warning. Be careful. Take care in this sort of situation and watch out for this kind of person. And if you do enter the orbit of a person like a Bluebeard, here are the things you need to do in order to survive, okay? Because there are Bluebeards out there in the world, real life Bluebeards. I don't mean men who, murder women necessarily, all that kind of thing. But what I mean is like men who accrue power and wealth and then use it not to be happy, but to inflict damage and suffering on other people, usually on women, because they are not as physically or financially as strong as men. So you might think of a figure like Harvey Weinstein, the film producer who had his way with all the film stars and whatever, and he was a horribly abusive, serial sexual harasser of women and so on. He used all of his power and his influence to abuse women and then cover it up. He's kind of a Bluebeard. There's also a story, not a story, like a TV show. My students were telling me about this the other day. I think they turned Bluebeard into a Netflix TV show called You, just Y-O-U, it's told from the perspective of a very charming, handsome young man who turns out to be a serial stalker of women. I haven't seen it, but I believe that's something like it. So it's a sort of a modern day updated version for Netflix of Bluebeard. So what she's playing with here is this idea that Bluebeard is a real kind of a man in the world. And this is a cautionary story she's telling us to warn us of such men, and also how to survive should you get caught up in his bloody chamber. In the story, the bloody chamber is going to be an actual literal place in the story, which will be like the Red Room in Bluebeard, and inside there will just be a kind of a house of horrors. That's really where the gruesomeness starts to kick in, I would say. The way Carter begins the story, though, kind of sets the tone for what's coming. It also creates our expectation. So as you read the story, as we begin the story, over the first 5 to 6 pages or so, I think it's really useful, just as you're going over it, just to underline, circle, highlight the following attributes of our main character. She doesn't have a name in the story, so I'm just going to call her the heroine. You can call her something else if you want to, but she's nameless in the story. That maybe tells you something about what Carter's up to as well. She doesn't want to give the central female character a name, so why would she withhold that? It's a question of maybe identity and power. To name something gives it a fuller identity, and therefore a kind of a self, a sense of self. In this story, the main character, the heroine, at the beginning anyway, doesn't really have a sense of self or inner authority or kind of agency, an ability to control her destiny. She kind of just goes along with whatever people expect of her and what she thinks society values. So you can see that in say her attitude. She's the one narrating the story. This is a story told in the first person, so it's told from her perspective. It's also told in the past tense. That's important. The very first words of the story are "I remember." So she's telling us a story that has happened and which is complete. So we know right at the beginning, from the very first two words, that this is something that happened a while ago. We don't know how long ago or when exactly it was. We don't even really know when in time the story is set. There are mentions of telephones and steam trains. So we're guessing that it's fairly modern, somewhere around the 70s or the 80s, 1970s or 80s or so. But this is something that's happened a while ago. It also means that because she's telling us the story, and we know this is the story of Bluebeard, we also see that she's survived. She's alive to tell the tale. So whatever it is that's happened to her, she has survived. The question, I guess, is how? How did she escape? How did Carter find a feminist way to tell what is ultimately a patriarchal fairy tale? How does she adapt it? So pay attention to her attitude in the story, the time, her behavior, what she's doing, what she's talking about, what she notices. Okay, the beginning part is describing basically the hours after she's just married the Marquis. And in the story, he's not called Bluebeard, by the way. He's just called the Marquis. I'll show you how that's spelled now, in case you are not sure. That he's a Bluebeard-like figure, a character inspired by Bluebeard, but not named as such. She will also describe what he looks like, his behavior. And again, when we first start the story, she's basically sitting on a train next to him. She's just married him, and she describes it as hurtling away from her girlhood in Paris, living with her mother and attending a music school. She's studying at the conservatoire to become a pianist. And she is on this train, sitting next to him. He's fast asleep. And that's when she introduces us to herself, starts to tell the story, and notices all of these things about her brand new husband, whom she barely knows and has just met. She's married him not because she loves him necessarily, but because he represents power and money and therefore opportunity. So you might actually say that our heroine here, despite being very naive and young, as the story starts, she's only 17 years old. Despite being naive, young, 17, not very worldly, she is something of to use a negative term, she's a gold digger. She wants to marry a rich man because she wants to be rich. And she wants to be able to look after her family. She's grown up very poor, without means, relatively powerless. And so the Marquis represents opportunity, growth, adventure. But he sees her as yet another one of his wives. He's been married 3 times already. All of his other wives have mysteriously died. They've been very glamorous, beautiful women, quite famous. Some are opera singers and models. But they've all mysteriously died way before their time. And that hints again at the Bluebeard story. We know that the girl, unbeknownst to her, is headed straight into danger. Also pay a bit of attention to her mother, who's an eagle-featured woman and also indomitable. Indomitable just means can't be dominated. She can't be defeated. Her mother is a very powerful woman and has had all these adventures and so on. So in contrast to the heroine, her mother is a kind of very capable, highly agentic figure. Agentic, I mean, she has a lot of agency. She's able to do things and achieve things and be strong. She also happens to have a gun and knows how to use it. And also pay attention to her behavior around the Marquis. I'm going to start looking at the story now. But I'm just telling you all this so we don't have to read every single page, and we can get through it quite quickly. But the marquis, the figure, again, the word marquis is a French word, and it basically just is like a member of the aristocracy, a French nobleman. The title might also be a pun, because the central plot point of the story is about a key that is marked with blood. So it's like mark key, could be a bit of a pun. She might be playing around with that. Also, the heroine is a pianist, so she's familiar with keys. And if you think about the keys on the piano, but if you think about what a key does, an actual literal key, it unlocks things and it reveals. But it can also lock and obscure, hide away, right? It can do both things simultaneously. The role of a key is to both reveal, but also to hide. And that fits in with what Carter's overall aim, I think, is in all of her stories, which is to her reimagined fairy tales kind of function like a key, which unlocks and reveals something buried away that you didn't know was in the story, but it is. And she draws it out, emphasizes it, and makes it the new meaning of the story for a modern world. But in the story, the Marquis is this rich, powerful man, and he's like described as though he's an animal. So her mother is eagle featured. The Marquis is like a cat, or some sort of like a feline figure. He's got this dark leonine shape, and he also has a dark mane with streaks of gray in it. She doesn't say that his hair is like a dark mane or reminds her of a dark mane, but rather that it literally is a dark mane. So it's like he's this big predatory cat, like a jaguar or a leopard or something like that. Just a beautiful creature, but in the beauty of it, like a tiger, is also deeply terrifying and extremely effortlessly powerful. So he's just imbued with all of these characteristics of power, but also predatory nature. And as we discover, he's been married 3 times. And she, although she's only 17 and basically not yet an adult, and she's married this much older, powerful man, she is throughout the story she's not afraid of him. She's actually quite fascinated by him. And in a way, I wouldn't say that she loves him, but he appeals to her greatly. She's very attracted to him. It's not like a purely transactional arrangement here. It's not a kind of arranged marriage. It's not a loveless, bloodless marriage. It's actually, there's a charge of appeal and attraction between them. And we'll see that play out in the story in a very, like I said earlier, kind of rather pornographic way. They go off to a castle. And this is where I'm going to start looking at the story itself. They go off to a castle which is described as being like a fairy idol. So a castle is important because that's a typical feature of a fairy tale, I guess. Rapunzel, a castle is usually a site of imprisonment in a fairy tale. You get locked away, you get stuck there, you get trapped there. It's like a prison more than anything else, from which the character must escape, but can't escape herself, typically has to be rescued. So these are all these cues that she's plugging into, that she's suggesting things to us. So it sets up an expectation, which we just know is going to be subverted, because this is Angela Carter. She doesn't play by the rules. She's anti-conformist. She's going to do something somewhere, somehow, that absolutely, knocks us off our feet or shocks us or is a twist in the story somehow. She sets us up and then is going to knock us upside the head later on in some way. But how's it going to happen? So let's start looking a bit at particular extracts from the story. It's going to share my screen here, so it takes a bit of time to set up. Got that one. Okay, so let me just cycle back to the beginning. So this is the Bloody Chamber. This is how it looks, the PDF version. And as I said, think it's important to note that the story begins as a story that's being told from the past. This is something that happened, and it's a story of a young girl being thrust away, as it says, from Paris, away from girlhood, away from the white enclosed quietude of my mother's apartment, into the unguessable country of marriage. So, such a lovely phrase, unguessable country of marriage. She's being shipped off somewhere, somewhat against her will, but not wholly, not quite, to this unguessable country, to somewhere that she is a foreigner. Marriage is this intimidating, scary thing, and she doesn't know what it's going to involve or what it's going to be like. She is, after all, only 17 years old. In the midst of my bridal triumph, she says later, I felt a pang of loss, as if when he put the gold band on my finger, I had in some way ceased to be her child, his mother, in becoming his wife. So here you just notice the vocabulary. I'm ceasing to be her child, her mother's child, and I'm becoming his wife. These are two words of possession, right? The character here, the heroine, is a possession in the story. She has some freedom and liberty, yes, and she's going to buck against her status as a possession later on in the story when she disobeys her husband and goes to look in his forbidden room. But in the beginning of the story, what she is something owned by other people. And actually, this status of hers is largely maintained throughout the story as you read. You realize that this is a girl who does not really have any independence. She doesn't have much, it's a word I'm using a lot here, much agency, much ability to do what she wants to do and overcome the constrictions placed upon her. She's not adventurous like her mother was. She's not an eagle like her mother is. She's not indomitable. Actually, she's quite easily dominated and generally goes along with the flow. And actually, that'll be the story of the heroine right throughout the story, even up to the very last words. We'll see that this is a character who remains quite passive. Okay. Now put that together with what I said earlier, which is that the story is a cautionary tale, and that Carter has maintained the fundamental theme of the story as being a cautionary tale. So these two things we put together now, and I say to you that what she's doing here is warning us, cautioning us about the dangers of being a passive person in your own life, whatever the conditions of your life are. It doesn't have to be as extreme as being married off to a serial killer or whatever, but in your own life, it's dangerous to be passive and to be static and not to take a chance, to take a risk, to stand up for yourself, and so on. It's actually dangerous to kind of do things in secret and instead of in public. In other words, like kind of fantasizing about breaking free instead of actually doing it, or doing things around the margins in secret, tiptoeing around other people rather than asserting yourself in front of them publicly, right? So kind of public exercises of your freedom is how you create a meaning and a place for yourself in the world. Passivity is the opposite. It's kind of like dying before you're actually dead. You can get married young and be passive your whole life. You may as well have, been dead at 20 but buried at 75 or something like that. And that's what the story is really, I think, about, is that overarching thing. Just whatever I've highlighted here are things that I think are interesting. I can't go over absolutely everything just for the sake of time. But when you look at how the Marquis is physically described, this is quite interesting. He was older than I. He was much older than I. He was streaked of pure silver in his dark mane, but his strange, heavy, almost waxen face was not lined by experience. Rather, experience seemed to have washed it perfectly smooth, like a stone on a beach whose fissures have been eroded by successive tides. She's a very poetic, lyrical, descriptive, and visual writer. And we're going to see her visual stuff really come into being soon. Like here again, he's got this leonine shape of his head. So leonine, dark mane. He's a big man, but he moves softly, as if all his shoes had soles of velvet, as if his footfall turned the carpet into snow. So if you've ever looked at like just a cat's paws, you know, the soft, those little pink pads of theirs, you can't even hear a cat creep up behind you. They're so soft. He's a big man, but he walks with a very gentle step, and there's a kind of a beauty in that, but also built into it is a threat. This big, beautiful creature, but you can't hear it when he's stalking up behind you, you know. And you get a lot of the kind of the backstory here. She describes herself as being just 17. So 17 is right on the brink of adulthood, but not quite yet an adult. You haven't, as I say, attained your majority just yet. You're 18. You're not yet an adult. So she's basically a girl. And we have here a huge age differential, which today in 2024, we would associate as being completely inappropriate. Let's say the Marquis is, I don't know, 55. He comes across as being 55 years old, more or less. Let's say that's the number. If a 55-year-old man married a 17-year-old girl, I'm not even sure he'd be allowed to legally, to be honest, in most countries, most places around the world. I don't think you'd be allowed to. And in country like South Africa or other developed countries around the world, we would, if that were to happen, we would condemn it. We'd say that's a moral scandal. It's an outrage. But in this story, it's kind of only passingly mentioned. It's not made a big deal of. In fact, it's not like the heroine has been forced into the marriage either. She isn't all the way passive. She's gone along with it because she thinks it's a good idea, but it is consensual. So there is a sense that she has the potential to decide things for herself, but errs on the side of being a little too passive in her life. She describes also the boating accident, the fact they never found the body of his last wife. So this is all kind of, it's a bit funny and it's suspicious. Like, we know, oh, come on, because nobody sees the fact that obviously Bluebeard's been, that the Marquis's been killing his wives off here systematically, but we don't know why, we don't know how yet. And she describes all of the other women, married 3 times, within my own brief lifetime, to 3 different graces. Now, as if to demonstrate the eclecticism of his taste, he had invited me to join this gallery of beautiful women. I, the poor widow's child, with my mouse-colored hair that still bore the kinks of the plaits, from which it had so recently been freed, my bony hips, my nervous pianist's fingers. So the way she describes herself physically is very as a weak person. She's a mouse. She's mousy, mouse-colored hair. Her mother's an eagle, but she's a mouse. The Marquis is a cat-like thing, and she's a mouse. She's merely the prey of other people, right? And these other women Bluebeard is married are beautiful, but she doesn't see herself that way. She's bony, got bony hips, nervous, skinny, small. She's poor, comes from nothing, but he is very rich as Croesus. Croesus was a very rich guy during the Roman Empire. The night before our wedding, a simple affair at the Marie, because his countess was so recently gone, he took my mother and me, curious coincidence, to see Tristan. Tristan is an opera. Oh, I don't exactly know what happens in Tristan, but it's like kind of a Romeo and Juliet thing. But it's kind of failed, unrequited love, star-crossed lovers. And do you know, my heart swelled and ached so during the Liebestod that I thought I must truly love him. Yes, I did. On his arm, all eyes were upon me. The whispering crowd in the foyer parted like the Red Sea to let us through. My skin crisped at his touch. So here, she says she loves him, but what she also loves is being seen with him. And this is another theme of the story, is that in so many different ways, the heroine here is always looking at herself, often in a mirror. And she likes this feeling of being seen, even by herself, but usually also by other people, men or crowds. She likes the whispering crowd, the sense of power she has, of notoriety, of fame. So it's not like she is entirely innocent and entirely passive. She has the ability to be quite crude herself in what it is that she wants. She does want something, and she's trying to get it by marrying this guy. So it is also kind of, it's kind of complicated. And here we see again this idea of mirrors everywhere. The Marquis watches her in the mirrors very often, like a connoisseur inspecting horse flesh, or even of a housewife in the market expecting cuts on the slab. I'd never seen, or else had never acknowledged, that regard of his before, the sheer carnal avarice of it, and it was strangely magnified by the monocle lodged in his left eye. When I saw him look at me with lust, I dropped my eyes, but in glancing away from him, I caught sight of myself in the mirror, and I saw myself suddenly as he saw me, my pale face, the way the muscles in my neck stuck out like thin wire. I saw how much that cruel necklace became me, and for the first time in my innocent, confined life, I sensed in myself a potentiality for corruption that took my breath away. The next day we were married. She's telling us the story of their getting together, and he gives her a necklace, a choker, actually, a choker made of rubies. And a choker is like a necklace that really fits very tightly around your neck. It rides high up on a woman's neck, and it's like almost like looks like a leash, like something you wear, put on an animal to control them. Yeah. But she actually kind of likes all this stuff. She likes being looked at. She likes looking at herself being looked at. And she feels this potentiality emerging in her for corruption. And that's another thing Carter does a lot throughout all of her stories, is that she takes her characters, usually female characters, from a place of innocence, of youth, and puts them through a situation, a very traumatic, dangerous one, which turns them into adults. They learn something from the trauma, from the danger, from the terrible circumstances. They learn something from it. And in learning, in expressing their own capacity for corruption, for doing bad things, for misbehaving even, they actually become adults. And that is another thing that's often unstated in fairy tales, that the stories very often have this element of youth losing its innocence and gaining experience. But in order to gain the experience, you must actually do adult things. And adult things can be quite violent or dangerous or upsetting, right? But you have to do them in order to grow up. It's not such a smooth, easy process. And for her, this is getting married to this beastly creature of a man. And I think the story is pretty long here, and she really goes into lots of detail, highly visual, describing the castle, the arrangement that they have. And then, of course, I guess, as you expect, for a new marriage, the marriage must be consummated. The couple must get together. They need to sleep together for the first time. So how is Carter going to do this? What is she going to show us? What is she going to? Because she's never a straightforward writer. So how is she going to depict this first night of their marriage? She describes it on page 10, and it's very weird because the bed in the main bedroom in the castle, the Marquis's bedroom, is surrounded on all sides by mirrors. So many mirrors on the walls. he'd filled the room with them to greet the bride, the young bride who had become that multitude of girls I saw in the mirrors, identical in their chic navy blue tailor-mades for traveling, madame, or walking. See, he said, gesturing towards those elegant girls, I have acquired a whole harem for myself. So she's standing in the bed where you know what is about to happen, is going to happen soon. And she's just surrounded by all these visions of herself, reflections of herself in these mirrors that the Marquis has put up. And he says, see, look at all these girls I have. They're all her, but he says it's like a harem. And a harem is basically a group of, it's a very old-fashioned word, harem. I guess the direct word translation would be something like a group of prostitutes that a man pays for, or owns. It's come from a word from ancient times, really. But he describes his own wife and her reflections as being his harem. So it's something that he views as ownership. He owns her. In a way, he's paid for her. He belongs to her, and he will do with her whatever she wants. At that moment, you'd realize, the heroine should realize, oh God, what have I gotten myself into? I need to get out of this situation extremely fast because this is bad, weird, and creepy. And she says, I found that I was trembling. My breath came quickly. I could not meet his eye and turned my head away out of pride, out of shyness. And watched a dozen husbands approach me in a dozen mirrors and slowly, methodically, teasingly unfasten the buttons of my jacket and slip it from my shoulders. And then basically he takes off all of her clothes, and she describes it as being like a ritual from a brothel. And he just strips her completely off, like he's got complete control over her. He's asserting all of his dominance over her. And she doesn't really do anything to fight back. She kind of shudders, as she says here later on. But she actually says that it's not like an unpleasant thing. She doesn't run away from it. She's slightly afraid, but not afraid enough to put up a fight and get the heck out of there. She also describes it as being pornographic, which makes sense because of all the screen stuff going on around her. She's able to have something done to her, but it's also reflected and mediated through this so that she can actually watch it happening as well. And Carter wrote this in like the 1970s or so, and I think I said this last time, that maybe this sort of thing isn't that shocking to us right now, but back then it might well have been quite a shocking depiction in a story. And certainly it's also ahead of its time in a way, because Carter, back then in the 70s, 80s, was pretty difficult to get pornography, to go to a shop and kind of embarrass yourself and buy stuff at like an actual shop if you wanted it. So it's very hard to get. These days, it's actually hard to avoid. You kind of see it almost everywhere around you. It's on social media. It's even in our popular entertainment, can be somewhat right there on the edge of tasteful and pornographic. I think the story kind of anticipates where the world was eventually going to go. And she's seeing this stuff, love, passion, marriage, as being something quite, having a dark heart to it, a pornographic element to it, where there is a power dynamic at play. The man is exerting some kind of control over the woman, and she's not really able to fight back. She shivers, she's afraid somewhat, but she's also super curious about it. And she goes with it. She actually kind of, in her own way, plays along with it and eventually gives her husband what he wants of her, right? She willingly gives it up. A dozen husbands impaled a dozen brides. As it says, it's an act of violence being done unto her, but at the same time, she's almost consenting to the violence. So it's a bit of a strange thing to say, but Carter's a strange writer and a complicated writer, and she's kind of saying that this combination love and marriage is not as straightforward and as romantic and lovely as you think it is. It's actually kind of also got an element of control and violence in it, okay, which the heroine does not fight back against. She kind of consents. She goes along with it. That's the key thing I want you to understand. That, remember, cautionary tale, dangers of passivity. You go with it. Be careful. Okay, I'm just going to go another like 5 minutes here looking at the story, and then we'll call it a day before I take any questions you have about part one. I just wanted to get to the point where the main point of the story. So it's about page 18. The Marquis is one of the reasons he's rich is because he's a successful businessman, and he gets a phone call one day. He gets called away. He has to travel to, I think, the United States from France on a business trip urgently. And so it's just going to be the young heroine in the castle alone with various like servants and stuff around. But she's basically being put in charge of looking after the castle. So this is the part Carter has carried through from the original story. And he gives her a set of keys. And it goes, one single key remained unaccounted for in the ring, and he hesitated over it for a moment. I thought he was going to unfasten it from its brothers, slip it back into his pocket, and take it away with him. What is that key? I demanded, for his chaffing had made me bold. The key to your heart. Give it me. He dangled the key tantalizingly above my head. Out of reach of my straining fingers, those bare red lips of his cracked sidelong in a smile. Ah, no, he said. Not the key to my heart, rather the key to my enfer. So enfer is a French word, and it means hell, H-E-L-L, hell. It's the key to my enfer. So he's saying to her, it's not the key to my heart. This is not a key to a nice place. This is the key to a terrible place. And then he says, every man must have one secret, if only one, from his wife. Promise me this, my way-faced piano player. Promise me you'll use the keys on the ring, except that last little one I showed you. Play with anything you find, jewels, silver, plate. Make toy boats out of my share certificates if it pleases you, and then send them sailing off to America after me. All is yours. Everywhere is open to you, except the lock that this single key fits. Yet all it is the key to a little room at the foot of the west tower, behind the still room, at the end of a dark little corridor, full of horrid cobwebs that you would get into your hair and frighten you if you ventured there. Oh, and you'll find it such a dull little room. But you must promise me, if you love me, to leave it well alone. It is only a private study, a hideaway, a den, as the English say, where I can go, sometimes on those infrequent yet inevitable occasions when the yoke of marriage seems to weigh too heavily on my shoulders. There I can go, you understand, to savor the rare pleasure of imagining myself wifeless. So he's saying, here's the keys to the whole castle, every room in the castle. But this one, not allowed. Don't you dare use. That's my secret place. I'm allowed to have my secrets. It's where I need to go to imagine what it would be like to be single again. Like, thanks for saying that to your wife. But his instructions are very specific. He's saying, don't go into that room there. You find it by turning left in the corridor and then going straight and then turning right. It's got a red door. Don't go into that one. He's sort of almost inviting her to do it. He kind of is cajoling her into it. He wants her to do it. It's a test. He's hoping she does because he wants her to find what is in there. What this room is the title of the story, The Bloody Chamber. Okay, it's going to be a bloody chamber. And what is inside there is described, so I'm going to flip ahead a little bit here, on page 26. I feel like I've run out of time, so I'm going to leave it here. We've done more than half the story, and I want you to read for yourself the rest. This is about 26 to page 42. Just going to see if I'm right about that. Yeah, about page 41, 42. So just make sure you read the last 16 pages of the story and all the events that go on, because it's pretty shocking and gruesome, but also very interesting. I will cover what happens in that in a follow-up short recorded video that I'll release Tuesday, Wednesday next week. So make sure you finish up the story so that you can be prepared for that little class that I'll do. Okay, let me come back to my side here. I just want to take a quick look at my slides in case there was something I needed to mention and didn't, but I'm going to get into some Q&A stuff now from you guys. If you have any questions about your assignment, please pop them in the chat or come on mic and we can chat about them. But I got up to here in the class, actually about this slide here, about page 26, 28. This is where we get to see the Chamber of Horrors being described for us. It's really, if you're familiar with the story 50 Shades of Grey, this might be ringing some bells. Also a kind of sadism. Maybe look up that word because I think it applies to the events in the second half of the story. Certainly there's a lot of sadistic stuff going on. Yes, indeed, a cliffhanger. So I wanted to leave it there. Do you guys have any questions for me about part one? I think some things that have come up in my other classes about it, just in case you've wondered and you're not sure, is for the film review question. I got a lot of questions about whether or not you're allowed to do things like write in the first person, which I think is absolutely fine for that question. You can be very subjective. You're meant to be offering, a reasonable opinion that you are proving, but it's going to be a subjective thing. So you can you can write in a different register. You don't have to write in a formal tone. It also doesn't have to be very rigorously structured like you would have with an essay. You can be looser. You can have some jokes in there. You can be kind of outrageous. You can definitely read some other film articles out there that you can find on really any other website or from a news outlet, just to get a sense of how other people do it. You'll notice that it's often it's not quite like an essay. It's way more subjective, loose, relaxed, informal. And that's something I've been trying to encourage with all my students for that particular essay. And then just things like what I like to see in an essay is, I'm not a super strict kind of marker when it comes to referencing and all that sort of thing. You've got to do it and do it well. But as long as you're trying to be accurate, I'm satisfied. I'm not going to subtract a huge amount of marks because you made little errors here and there. I'm not that kind of a lecturer, not that kind of a marker necessarily. But what I do look for is that it's kind of evidence that you really did read or watch the text at hand. So when you're writing this essay, make sure that you're almost treating that primary text, the actual movie or the book or the story or whatever, you're kind of treating that almost as a sacred thing. Like that is where all of your information is coming from. And what I actually want to see is that you have a view on it, that you have an interpretation of it, which can be influenced by what I've said in class, what you've seen in my slides. It can be influenced by other things you've read or seen. As long as you back up your view with rational evidence and argumentation, then you've got a strong piece of work. But I really want to see you connecting in good faith with the actual primary work. So it's all about paying very close attention to the thing you are actually studying. Also why I like to warn students off using websites like SparkNotes, Study.com, GradeSaver, LitCharts. These are sites that give you summaries of the story, but there's nothing on there that you yourself don't already know because you will have watched the film or read the books. Those are just saying things that are in the book already. They're just giving you summaries. So you don't need those websites for anything. That should just be stuff you are able to talk about already because you are familiar with the texts at hand. So Just use those credible sources, and most of all, just bring your own ideas out. You are absolutely allowed to say what you think. It's not necessarily the case for other subjects, which are more theory-based, but English, it's about interpretation, writing, having a view, offering opinions. So you're allowed to do that in your work. I got a question here. Do we have to put headings like introduction? I would say no. It should just be evident, paragraph by paragraph, what it is that you're dealing with. Because I will, in reading the work, I'll be able to see what it is that you are covering there. So you don't have to do that stuff. It also like saves you words in the word count. It's not really something you ever see in a film review. You know, you would never read a film review that's got headings in it necessarily, unless the headings are trying to guide you towards something very specific. Is there any WhatsApp group? I actually completely forgot to start a WhatsApp group. If you guys, I don't know, the thing is that I think there's a link. Did you send me a link? I think somebody sent me a link. The thing is that I might need your phone numbers to start a group, and I don't have access to your phone numbers and stuff like that. But if there is an existing group, and there might be one, then perhaps just ask somebody to add you. But I'm not an admin, and I don't have access to phone numbers and stuff. So I'm not sure if I'm able to do that. But there could already be a group going on. Yeah, hopefully that's okay. Anything else that you guys want to know about? Any questions? Sources are covered. I think also we are asked to come down really hard on AI. They really are pushing us quite hard. So I think the easiest way around AI is just not to use it, unless you use it for something very basic, like helping you with a definition or something like that. But then you've got to reference it. You've got to be able to show us your prompts and all that stuff. So it's quite a lot of legwork for just a basic definition. So I would just avoid it entirely, to be honest. And then just remember to really be careful about your deadlines. If you hand in late by 24 hours, we have to actually take off 15%. So make sure you avoid anything like that, because we actually, as lecturers, we have no power to kind of give you extensions, and we have no ability to not give you the 15%. It actually just gets taken off automatically now as part of the marking system that we have. So make sure you are familiar with your date, your times, and when exactly to hand in. So I think that's it. Again, just a reminder to read the rest of the story, and I'll do a short recording on it just to wrap it all up. That will be the end of learning Unit 2, and after that we'll be moving on in the next 2 weeks, 3 weeks or so, to learning Unit 3, which is resistance poetry. So check out the prescribed readings for that. They're poems, so it's quite easy to do the reading. You can also find audio recordings of the poems on YouTube if you want to listen to them instead. And we'll be starting that after next week, going to learning Unit 3. And then I was asked to just pass on one more message, which is that tomorrow evening at 6 o'clock, there is going to be what are they calling these things? It's a library session. Our librarians will be doing one. It's called Introduction to Databases and EBSCOhost. And it will be on the 5th of September, so that's tomorrow at 6 o'clock. Introduction to Databases and EBSCOhost, conducted by one of the online librarians. So if you're interested in learning more about EBSCOhost and how to track down good sources, that's a workshop that you should definitely attend. Okay, so basically at 7 o'clock on the head here. Shall we leave it there for this evening? I'll see you guys again in 2 weeks, and you'll hear back from me in a recording in about a week or so. Good luck for your assignments. Good luck for part 1. Hopefully all is going well. I have also added 2 new ICE tasks for you to complete. I said ICE tasks are going to be due on October 15th. Today they said all ISTARs have to be in on October 11th. So I actually have to change that date. Got to hand them in on October 11th. So there's another 2 added. They're both under blogs. You can find them quite easily. And then I'll add a 4th in the next couple of weeks. Okay, cool. I'll try and see how this group, if we can make this group thing happen too. So check out ICE tasks, look under blogs, complete them ahead of time. They'll be due on October 11th. Good luck for everything. I will see you soon, and stay well. And you need my email. Let me put my email in the chat here for you. It's just varsitycollege.coza. Okay, let me end the recording so long.